Good vibrations.
So, my output since the start of 2024 has taken an unexpected turn where I've been getting into subjects that I'd never previously looked at and never planned to. And through what I've come to term my God videos, I've had quite a few names thrown at me from many people suggesting that I should have conversations with them and get their take on these big questions that I've got. And one name that's kept coming up consistently in terms of suggestions is today's guest. So I'm very happy to be chatting with Howdie Mickoski. Welcome on, brother.
Hi, good to see you. We were in the same conference in Bath, but you were in the morning and I was in the evening, and we never ran into each other there. But here we are.
Right. Yeah, that was a great event. But yeah, we missed each other either way.
Yeah.
So lots to get into today. And I think it's fair to say that you've had a pretty extraordinary life with a lot of signpost moments that seem to have all converged to set you on the path to the type of research and the work that you're doing now. So, just to set the tone, would you care to share with the listeners some of your key anecdotes from your life? In particular, we should talk about your near death experience in a waterfall in 2005, but anything else you want to just bring up there to help put things into perspective first off?
Yeah, sort of the general life overview, which was I grew up kind of a fairly normal-ish individual. Well, however you want to say normal, growing up in Canada. Hockey player, kind of did that, went to my university, took history there. But in the course of history, or in the course of doing my university, I had some immediate challenges. I had a psychopathic father who stole all of my money just before I finished university. So that caused a really big turn in sort of seeing just how things operate here and how people are. And then just after I finished university, I had an ex-girlfriend get murdered. So from those two experiences, I kind of never really had a big, I guess what you'd call philosophical mind. I was curious on various subjects, but I was just living a fairly normal life. But after those two things, it kind of sunk me into a really deep depression. But in the midst of the depression, I was asking a lot of questions. Like I was trying to understand in my own head a very strange and painful kind of place. It got to the point in around 1997 where I was so depressed I actually wanted to kill myself, and I just couldn't come up with a really good way to do it that wouldn't be messy for anyone that would have to clean it up. And right around my birthday, 1997, there was a documentary came on a Nova documentary on this old pyramid. It was like an instantaneous. It was almost like flash of light that, okay, this is what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to study ancient Egypt. And in the course of the next 8 years, not only was I studying the ancient world and Hermeticism and alchemy, I was lucky enough to start meeting individuals who really had the ancient knowledge. So I spent time with a Korean monk. I spent time with several native medicine men on the reserves in Canada. And in the course of all of those 8 years, I was being given exercises and being given tests, or we'll call it ways to test reality. So I was constantly testing reality for 8 years while I was writing that first book. And reality, of course, failed every time. Every time I tried to test reality, it would fail. When I'd finally finished the book and been to Egypt and been to Mexico and done what needed to be done there, I thought I knew quite a bit. I thought I was pretty smart. I had seen through reality. Oh, reality is an illusion. It's transparent. Okay, I figured that out. Problem was I was still very real. The Howdy thing was still a very real thing in the world. Yeah, then in 2005, I had a death experience where I fell in a waterfall just before a waterfall in the Rocky Mountains in Alberta. And in the course of that death experience, everything that I'd ever thought I was kind of just burned away in the dying. And what was left was the realization of, oh yeah, all of that is fake. I'm just as fake as reality. But all there was a an underlying awareness or underlying observer that had been there all the time, that had been kind of just watching everything that this character had done. So that took about 10 years of dealing with it. I had a lot of challenges from it. I didn't integrate the experience very well. I rushed into the world too quickly and had 10 years with a lot of actually illness. I had illness problems for 10 years. That slowly began pulling away around 2018, 2019, and two books came out in 2020. One was on my death experience and on the work I did up to that point, and then was the book on the World's Fairs that also came out right at the time that our insanity started in this reality. So it was an interesting combination. From there, I started the YouTube channel and started the interviews like this happening. Went through that process for about 2 years, and then realized it was time to write. And there was something else that needed to be written that people really liked when I talked about Plato's Cave and this reality and spiritual warfare. So I dug into that in more detail for people, and then came out with Exit the Cave. That was in the end of 2022. I did write I wrote another sports origin book last year, and then now I'm working on a new Exit the Cave too. So there's your short overview, and you can take that wherever you'd like to go with that.
Yeah, appreciate that. So how many books have you written now in total?
Six that I would stand behind and say that I like. Two that were very early on that were very poor, and I'm glad no one's buying them.
Yeah, I've got the same thing. I wrote a book very early on called Tales from the Flipside, which I put out in 2007. And it's when I was still completely in a Matrix mindset and I was a DJ, and it was just a bunch of funny stories from the DJ game. So I tend not to talk about it. I talk about my musical truth books beginning 2016, but a lot of people don't realize I had that early one. So yeah, it's kind of,
Of course, like you would probably say, it was helpful for, I mean, those books taught me how to write in a sense. It taught me what writing was about, but the actual product that came out was really, really poor.
yeah,
But it did teach me what I needed to do for later on. So they were helpful, those early ones, but yeah, that's really all they were, was just teaching tools of writing.
exactly. And I think it's that way with so much of what we do in our lives. It's grounding for what we're going to do later on when our real work begins. So you build up certain skill sets and certain talents and certain experiences, and it's not clear what they're going to be used for until sometimes quite relatively late in life, I feel.
Well, yes and no. I mean, again, you're now talking to a guy who has seen through reality. So that concept that there's some sort of plan like that, and that certain things that A is leading to B is leading to C is leading to D, even if there is such a plan, that's not in my best interest, the true me anyway. All of this is false. All of this is some sort of deception. All of this is some sort of lie. So for me, even though that concept might seem true from watching reality, I also know that it's another deception. It's also false. The only work that's required is an inward journey, a spiraling inward of asking really deep questions like, who am I? Why am I here? What is death? What is life? Um, why is there a reality? Why is existence the way it is? That's pretty much it. Everything else is just kind of, yeah, like you say, it's, you kind of have to have one foot in the reality your whole life. Like if you don't have some grounding, Richard Rose, who's a teacher I really liked from Virginia, he used to talk very clearly about, you have to have your house in order, that you can't do any real inner work if your outer life is a complete mess. So if your life is a complete mess, that's where you have to start. You have to get that in order. You have to have the grounding first. Then once you've got the grounding and you have the energy free, now you can turn that inward and do something with it. And unfortunately, so many people on a spiritual path, or who claim they're on a spiritual path, they are they're looking to deny their own pain, deny their own suffering. They're chasing some sort of happiness. They're chasing some sort of blissful, happy experience. They're even or chasing knowledge, chasing information. All the while, it's an outward thing that eventually someone has to see. They have to stop that. And in a way, I got kind of lucky with that, because of not just the way the Egyptian program revealed itself, but because I was very lucky with the teachers that came into my life like really early on, and they they directed certain pathways very, very clearly and kept me away from a lot of things that would have just been walking in circles, wasting time.
Right. Was there a point at which you felt you'd found some clear answers to the question of what this reality is, what created it, what controls it? Or were you still searching for those meaningful answers? Is it an ongoing process for you?
Yeah, it's an ongoing process, and like I always like to tell everybody, always it's everything I share is it's my own opinion, it's my own thesis. Yes, it's come after 25 years and after a lot of work and after a lot of personal exercises and inner seeking, but it's I'm sharing what I'm sharing is not that I want someone necessarily to believe it. It's what I'm sharing is for people to ask some questions themselves then and kind of say, well, okay, this guy kind of seems somewhat normal. So he says some things that are pretty unique. So how can I test that out for myself? And that's really what it is. It's testing it out for yourself. Now, there's some things I'm very confident. I've tested them out for myself about reality and about this thing here. And I'm confident I have that answer. There's some other things that are still a bit fuzzy and there's still work to be done. And it's part of the reason I'm writing the new book because it's not just a book for others, it's a book for myself of clarification of what is the things I really see or don't see about reality, and I'm finding my own holes, you might say, in what I think I know.
Right. So, what is it about the conventional idea of Plato's cave that doesn't cut it for you? Because you're challenging that idea in your books, I think.
Yeah, I'm actually in the new book. I'm going dealing with Plato even more. I'm finding that he's not a trustworthy source at all.
There goes another one.
Yeah, exactly. But just from the allegory itself, the famous allegory of the cave, uh, I had been taught, or I'd come to believe, because everyone else believed it, that this particular allegory was the best presentation or story of how to understand reality. And of course, it becomes the basis of some really important movies like Dark City and The Matrix and The Truman Show and Pleasantville and all sorts of movies like around 2000 had the Plato's Cave analogy as built into the story. And I had just assumed, well, the story must be really good. And when I actually went to start writing the book again in 2022, I thought I should look at I need to look at it. I should read it again. Not because I was questioning it. I was reading it just because I'm going to find some good quotes and I'm going to really make my quick introduction of Plato's Cave but then once I started reading it again carefully, I was like, everything that's important is not here. All of the important information is not here. So I'll give you this example and we can discuss it. This is, like I say, right from the book, which is the way the story is presented is that it's Socrates is speaking to Plato's brother Glaucon, and he gives this example of he says, "What if a bunch of prisoners were brought into a cave and they were chained to their seats and chained to their to rocks and seats in such a way that they could only see forward, they could only see the walls, and then behind them a big fire was lit." Objects were placed in front of the fire that placed shadows on the walls. Music and ideas were played, and the prisoners would, of course, believe that what they're seeing on the walls is reality. So that's the beginning of the Plato's Cave story. But right away, we're missing all of the important information. We're missing what prisoners? Why are they prisoners? Where did they come from? Why are they not in a prisoner of war camp? Why are they in a cave? What kind of cave is it? Who made the cave? Is it man-made or did these people make the cave? We have questions of who are these people that are spending all this time, or these beings to spend time tricking a bunch of prisoners. Normally, if you have prisoners, all you want to do is keep them confined in a certain area until the war ends or you make a trade or whatever. Why do you need to trick them? Who is doing all the deception? So all of those the most important questions of the Plato's cave analogy are not there. They're skipped right over. And I had to realize either A, it was a much longer, more detailed story and was somehow edited. All this key stuff was edited out by the time it's come to us, or it was written in this way, means it was written as a type of deception. I'm not sure which one it is, but it's obvious that the key stuff is missing.
Okay. I want to circle back around to the philosophical, spiritual stuff in due course. But I also want to ask you about the concept of the world's fairs because you're very well known for speaking on this subject as well. Could you just give the listeners a quick overview of how this first came across your radar and what this general subject is? Because I think it all ties in ultimately.
It does ultimately tie in. Unfortunately, like any subject, it's easy for someone to just keep studying something beyond when you've reached what you need to know. That's a very standard thing. So I tend not to study much history anymore for that reason. I've moved on to other areas. But the fairs themselves were my way of seeing that history is a lie. So I had already seen that archaeology is a lie, that ancient history, through writing the first book, The Power of Then, that was okay. So all we've been told about the ancient world's a lie, but I was still fairly confident in the modern, so say from 1800 to now, that there was a Napoleon and a Waterloo and a U.S. Civil War and whatever we're told about World War I and all these kind of things. Okay, that's relatively true. Those things happen. But when I was in Florence in 2019, and I was studying cathedrals, and I was studying them for how they were machines to basically energy devices that had nothing to do with any kind of religious idea, that they were built as energetic machines. And when I came back from Florence, the buildings obviously gave me an energetic charge. And it was only a day or two later that I bumped into some videos on the World's Fairs. And amazingly, okay, so I studied history, a 4 year degree in history. I even took late 18th century American history. Never once was the World Fairs brought up in any of the things I'd studied. And once I looked into things like the Chicago Exposition of 1893, which was 700 acres, supposedly built in 2 years with massive structures. The manufacturer's building could house 300,000 people. These things were just giant, all claimed to be built in 2 years with no machinery. And in fact, when you could dig into the story, it's even more insane of what actually how it's claimed to have been constructed. And this happened all. And then I realized, well, this happened all over the world. They happened all over the United States. They happened in London, in Paris, in Milan, in South America, in Asia. And usually they would build these giant, massive events, 500,000 acres. And then as soon as they were done, they'd bring in dynamite and blow them up. That combination of impossible building times, incredible structures, no explanation of really what was going on, and then the total destruction of it is where that got me interested. That got me interested. Well, no, how come no one has written a book on this? Somebody has to write on this. Well, I guess it'll be me. But it was 3 months in combination of when I talked to a building contractor about the building side, but now the buildings themselves, that's the least important, or from my perspective, the least important part of the problem. It's two things. It's one, it's what was actually going on at the fairs. It's what they were actually presenting, what the exhibits were, what was going on at the human zoos. All of those things is what's really important. It was a giant propaganda tool before radio, before television, before movies, that you could basically just have a cut and paste presentation package, and it's like you just tour it all over the world and you get a message across. And that's when I wrote in the book about the idea of resets, which was running through the alternative history community already at that time. There's some really good researchers, right? Guys like John Levy was already working then, and John Levi, I guess say his name right. There was a Russian guy who no longer is on the internet, and a couple other people. And they were putting out some really good stuff on this subject, but it was still like in its infancy. The flat Earth had taken sort of the focus for a while, and now this idea of mud floods, Tartaria, that began to take up everyone's focus. But no one had written a book about it. But once I realized that the issue becomes this word reset. And I put that in the book in 2019. And then all of a sudden in April 2020, May 2020, this word reset is just getting thrown all over the place. And that's when I realized, holy crap, the thing that we're going through now, the world fairs were the end of the last reset in this realm. The last time this realm was, in a sense, you might say, burned to the ground and restarted. the World Fairs were the starting point of telling we'll call them survivors, or we'll call them the people that were there at the time anyway. This is the new way to think. This is the new way to be. These are the new rules of the current realm. And I began seeing that, well, we're going through whatever happened before the fairs started. And then I began to wonder, well, what would be the equivalent of the fairs after this is done, the new teaching tool? So to me, yeah, that's why they are important, because they're not about what was going on in the late 1800s. They're about right now, because in a sense, we're going through a similar package as that time period.
Right. So is the idea that the World's Fairs were sort of training centers for the so-called elites, where they got real knowledge of what this realm is all about, and they were fed all
No,
the propaganda? Right. And
no,
because they
it's for the masses.
right, okay, so it's propaganda for the masses.
Propaganda for the masses, right? They in a sense, particularly history. This is a really interesting thing, that I think they built the historical narratives that they wanted the world to start believing in. Because if we can assume that somewhere in what we call the 1800s, pretty much this whole world might have been burned to the ground. The the city fires all through the United States is a really good example, that it's just too coincidental that every city in the US burns down in the course of, 50 years. It's just that doesn't happen by accident. That's usually war, some kind of giant natural destruction. So I think that an entire historical narrative is one of the many things that were done, along with science, along with religion, along with all kinds of things. But it's particularly the historical narratives that I think were presented, and the ones that were going to the World's Fairs. The people who actually went to these things were not commoners. They couldn't afford it. They couldn't afford to be there.
Right.
So it's sort of like middle to upper class people. So for sure, all of the teachers would have been there, all of your university professors, anybody who had some form of, let's call it, influence, particularly over younger people, of which also we have all of these orphans and kids around. We have then all of a sudden this class of adults getting educated at the World Fairs, and when they come back and teach their class and say, well, this is what I learned at the World Fair, how can it be wrong? It's the Smithsonian Institute and these other special organizations telling us what the history of the world is. And when you actually look into the scale and the scope of the historical exhibits that were at these fairs, it's mind blowing. I have a couple of pages in my book on just the historical exhibits that were at the St. Louis Fair. They each needed like 10,000 actors, and you were literally walking into recreations of ancient Rome or the Siberian Railroad or Barcelona or Paris or whatever. And it was like, you're not just reading or seeing something. I mean, having these live historical interactions. And of course, if you went through something like that psychologically, you'd believe you were just watching gladiators. You were just watching Rome in the Middle Ages. You were just seeing Paris. And, you were fooled, I think, on the scale of what was done. So to me, yeah, I see it was everything we think of our world now was, in a sense, constructed and presented through these world fairs. And of course, they're still going on today. They just had one in Dubai like last year or 2 years ago. And there again, that fair was indicating what's coming next. It was all about AI, artificial intelligence, and robots, and why robots will make your life so much better. And I mean, so we're seeing that the world fairs are like the indoctrination tool of where things are headed, even today.
Hmm. So the Victorian era world fairs were destroyed by dynamite to get rid of the evidence, but there were some
Yeah,
remnants which remained. I mean, how do we know that they took place? There's some stuff that wasn't
yeah.
destroyed, I guess.
Well, we've got two problems. Is one, we only have generally one building remaining. They always said there was one building that housed the most important art, and that one had to be built permanently to secure all this art. But all the other stuff, it didn't matter yet. The claim is that these are built with staff, a type of plaster, and placed up on wood, similar to like a movie set. That's the claim of how they could be so large and be built so fast. But things like the Buffalo Electric Tower, that was 220 feet, 250 feet high, with an elevator that ran to the top. you're not building a 250-foot structure out of plaster and wood, and then having a whole bunch of elites taking elevators to the top to take views of the fair. You don't want to have the thing collapse and kill 1,000 important people. So when you begin to realize that the majority of the buildings were real structures, I don't say they didn't build smaller structures or easy, we'll call them simplified structures, because you can see certain photographs that they did. That's the second problem, is the photographs, particularly construction photographs. So we have construction photographs, and when I took them to various building contractors here in Norway where I live, they were very clear in the construction photos that, like, there's nothing going on here. There's no stack of wood, there's no stack of materials, there's no coffee cup on the ground. Where are these? There's supposed to be 50,000 workers. Where are they going to the bathroom? Where are they getting their meals from? They were very clear. Nothing's gone on in this picture for like a year. They just put some scaffolding up on the side of a building and said they're working. So it was that kind of information from qualified builders who are doing this every day of their life that helped me indicate there was something wrong with the construction photos. And then the third part of the problem is when you actually get photos of the fair. So this is your question: did they really happen? I'm going to say yes, they did. But I did a I made a blog post 3 months ago where I speculated that maybe the fairs were much smaller than we were told, that they did happen, that they were much smaller. And what they did is they built gigantic models, gigantic dioramas, and then photographed the dioramas, pretending that the fair was much bigger than it was. Because if you look at a lot of the photographs of these things, they're very similar to photographs I show of current diorama and model makers. They're all from a higher perspective. They're coming down on the image. If it's an indoor picture, you'll get a lot of this sort of white vanilla sky background, and it's pristine. There's no garbage anywhere. It's exactly the way a model would look. A model is detailed enough of the key things you want to show, but it doesn't detail everything. That's a lot of the World Fair photos. So I'm now at a point where I have no idea. I can honestly say I have no idea what the World Fairs were. I have no idea, other than I'm pretty sure they happened. I don't think it's fake. I don't think that someone can say it was all just a model and they made the whole thing up. No, I think something really did occur at all of these spots all over the world. I'm wondering though if it was much smaller than we were told, and that would allow an actual building process to happen in the time frame that they said it did. It's a lot easier to build 70 acres of real buildings and 600 acres of model, within a 2-year time frame.
So the time period we're looking at here is the late Victorian era, sort of late 1800s, very early 1900s.
Yeah, the first one started in England in 1851, supposedly at the Crystal Palace. Another bizarre story of, a building that just has no explanation. And there were all these crystal palaces then all of a sudden built everywhere all over the world. Every single one of them burns in a fire, which is just stunning, right? There's like, I don't know, 20 crystal palaces in the world, and they all burn down. So those go through, and the first American one is 1876. The reason the ones, as opposed to like Paris had one in the 1860s, they had one in the 1880s where supposedly the Eiffel Tower's built. They had another one in 1900. They're in Milan. They're all over the place. The challenge is with Europe, it's supposed to be old. So if you see a really nice building, you can say, well, maybe that comes from the 1500s. They've had 500 years to build. But a place like Philadelphia or Omaha or Nashville or a lot of these places in the United States they're supposed to be nobody living there until the early 1800s. So how does a bunch of frontier cowboys and whatnot all of a sudden piece together these massive, and not just the World Fairs themselves, but in the United States, these state capitol buildings, which are always they look like St. Peter's in Rome, like the kind of magnificence is just, it's staggering. Again, why some cowboys in Iowa or Oklahoma need something like that. So this continues, like this kind of building, this kind of architecture, and this kind of what we'll call technological superiority and racial superiority. Racial superiority was also a very important part of the fairs. That runs till 1915. The last of the big world fairs was the Panama Exposition in Los Angeles and San Diego in 1915. Amazingly, most of the countries, it's World War One. So World War One's been going on for a year. Almost all the countries in the world sent stuff across the Atlantic to be at the 1915 exposition. They should be worried about things being blown up by submarines, but apparently it's no problem. We'll just send all this really expensive artwork in the middle of the greatest war the world has ever known. We'll send them to a World Fair in 1915. Then the fairs stopped for a few years and they restarted again in the 1920s, but the ones after that were completely different. Now it had a completely different tone, completely different look. It had a very futuristic approach now, and that science was going to answer all of your questions, when prior to this, it was technology that was going to answer all of your questions.
So how do orphan trains tie into this whole idea?
Yeah, so that becomes the next part. So as I kept digging into the material of that particular time frame, that we'll say 1850 to 1900 specifically, just to give a time frame, but the big fairs go on for a few years after that, but roughly those eras. We've got two also very strange things happening in the United States. One are these orphan trains, the other is mental asylums. So orphan trains are supposedly tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of orphans in the east coast of the United States being put on trains and shipped into the western part of the country. No one ever explains, though, where these kids come from, why there's so many orphans, what happens to their adults. They attempt to give answers, but the answers are always very vague and very non-logical. They don't really make any sense. It's just all of a sudden, it's just the realization you've got a whole bunch of kids, which is how you would want to run a post-reset world. You want, if you're going to rip down a whole society and a whole civilization, the best thing to build with afterward is kids, because they have no knowledge, they have no memory of anything, and they will believe whatever you tell them. More so if it's coming out of extreme trauma, they will be more believing of the ones that they're calling, let's say, that are saving them from the hellish reality. So it makes sense. You just need enough adults around to sort of supervise the children, get them to do what you want them to do and believe what you want them to do. And within a generation, it would only take 20 years. And by the time they're now parents and have their own kids, the doctrine and the ideas you want implanted would be there. So there's no other reason why there would be all of a sudden so many children with no parents and just being shipped all over the country. But like I say, at the same time, there is this building spree of insane asylums, not just in North America, all over the world. And they're opulent. Like, they're not just like a regular little hospital. They're bigger than Medici palaces in Italy. They're massive, beautiful structures. So why age are you supposed to build something so magnificent for some insane people? Two, why are there so many insane people that everywhere in the world needs these giant buildings? Again, that would make sense if after a reset, you have a bunch of people who still remember the pre-period, the time before. And if they're not going to go along with the new system, if they're not going to go along with the new ideas, that's a good way to just put them away for a while, hopefully break them down so that they will eventually come to follow the party line, you might say, and then you can send them out and they can become a good slave too. And if they don't, well, okay, you just kill them off in there, who cares? I think that's what was going on, that we had a huge number of people who remembered the old world. The same would be the Native Indians. It's another reason I think this is also the time period when the major final destruction of, we'll call them native populations in the world, was happening. And again, it was because they would have especially deep oral history, especially deep knowledge of a long time in the past that would be very different from what was being experienced. And we'll call them I call them influencers. I don't like to call them controllers. The influencers who think they're running this reality needed to get rid of everything as much as possible to forget the old world. When I was in with one of the medicine men in the sweats, this was in a Sutina medicine man in Alberta. And he was talking about some of the ceremonies when he was beginning to teach me various ceremonies in Sweat Lodge. And he said, unfortunately, what he, meaning all the current medicine men of his tribe know now, it's nothing compared to what we knew 500 years ago. Most of that is lost. They have whatever they have is just the remnant of it. And he was always clear to me that if somebody from like 500 years ago, a medicine man could come in from 500 years ago, the power that they would have would be beyond anything any of us could imagine, because so much has been lost. And yeah, I'll just leave it there and let you talk.
Well, there'd certainly be a lot of use for these insane asylums in these times. They'd need to build many more. Could think of plenty of people that need to, populate those places. As you said, there's been a real resurgence within truth alternative circles of the idea of lost civilizations in recent times, with a particular emphasis on Tartaria. We hear a lot about that lost empire. There's also the idea of mud floods and these periodic resets that you mentioned through human history. And this all points to us having been lied to about humanity's true history. That's the overriding theme that ties all these things together, I feel, particularly in the relatively recent past. We're going back, 150 years or so, or not much more than that, and the history books having been altered accordingly. In your view, are all these subjects, World's Fairs, Orphan Trains, Tartaria, Mud Floods, resets, ultimately related? And does the soul trap tricked by the light stuff tie into that? Or do you think each of these subjects has to be taken and viewed in isolation of each other?
No, that's all part of the giant deception, right? Everything anyone's ever been told since the moment, actually even before you were born, because we're getting interactions prior to our birth. So literally from our, what we'll call awarenesses pulling into this matrix, we're being lied and deceived to completely. Pretty much everything we've ever been told is a lie. And in the historical sense, if we're just talking about history now, then this is what I came to realize, that everything we're told about history is a lie. And it's not just, even if we go into recent history, well, we even have video footage of the Kennedy assassination, and we don't even know what happened there. We have no clue what happened on that particular day, other than it literally changed the reality, but we don't know what happened. The moon landing is pretty obviously fake. So even in like the last 50 years, and the largest events of our reality are obviously lies. Everything we're getting told about what's going on currently is, at the very least, a giant manipulation, a giant distortion. Whether it's also a lie, hard to say. So it indicates that we haven't been told anything truthful about anything. And that's why, for me, like, I don't really need to study history anymore. I don't need to go look into another building, another war, I know whatever's being told is a lie. Like, I already know, okay, whatever the narrative is, that's false. So that's just gonna, now that I know that, that'll just take more and more time away from what I think is important. So, like any subject, as long as a person believes that something is true, whether it's science, whether it's religion, whether it's philosophy, whether it's a commercial system, whether it's a government system, it doesn't matter what system, as long as you think it's true, your job, I think, is to test it, prove that it's actually, that whatever's being presented by, we'll call it the system, is true, or is valid, or is useful, or is of some help, truly some help to you. And then if you can prove it that it's true, great. Okay, then you can say, well, this area is true. I found that so far, nothing. No area I've ever looked in that I can say is true. And so I don't need to look further. Like, I don't need to find more of the same lie over and over and over again. There comes a point where you've seen Plato's cave clearly enough. Once you've seen Plato's cave as a deception and a lie, and that there's nothing truthful. And when by Plato's cave, I don't just mean the material realm. I mean the material, the etheric, the astral, the nirvana, the heaven, the super duper realm, the whatever realm you want to call it. Every single one of them is a deception. Every single one of them is a lie. And so eventually, when you see through all of that and see you've seen the prison clearly enough, the only answer is, well, what's outside of the prison? What then is not prison? And what then is not deception? What is not lie? And eventually that becomes the only thing you start focusing on, because studying the deception too long is another deception. So there also has to, it's a very important part of the work, is to realize when it's time to say, I've done enough in this area. It's time to stop. I've got these other areas that I need to test as well. And yeah, so that's why it does all tie in, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what someone studies. It's just you can take it to the bare base of, can you prove it's true? Can you prove it has any value or use whatsoever? And unfortunately, I found the answer is no.
So it seems we've circled back around to the more spiritual, metaphysical questions from some of the stuff that goes on in this apparent reality. And where do you stand with the overall idea of simulation theory? Because this is another popular idea in recent times, that we find ourselves in some sort of virtual reality AI type simulation, and somehow our souls have been trapped and tricked into being here. Because I personally can't imagine any of us volunteering to be a part of this crazy, fucked up reality. I certainly can't anyway. What's your standpoint on the whole idea of simulation theory?
I like it as a metaphor. Um, when we get I mean, I use it, and I use the word myself in my books and in the talks that I do, simply because it's a valuable idea to share with our current reality now that everyone understands computers and video games. And so a few thousand years ago, it was always a dream, right? It was, oh, that's how it was presented in ancient texts. The world is a dream. The world is a type of illusion. And I as an example, that was the key metaphor, like in the 1990s when I was starting my exploration of reality. And granted, there did become a point in time when I'd done enough exercises and reality became transparent. Like, it got to the point where I had to hold on to chairs before I would sit down, because I wasn't sure the chair would still be there. It was literally, I'd gotten to a point where reality was absolutely malleable, transparent, and could change instantaneously. And it was, on one sense, freeing, and on one sense, very, very difficult to deal with the day to day reality. But that's when I understood, through my own experiences, which are, there's many of them, that, oh yeah, reality's, I know what it means. Reality's a dream. Okay, it's not real. So now when you call it a simulation, it actually adds a secondary tone to it, because not only is the simulation, first of all, the simulation is not actually real, but it is based on something. Like, it's, a simulation can't be just totally made up. It's built, it's based on something. And this is very clear when you go into the texts of the early Gnostics or the Cathars. They always call this a copy, or they call this realm a type of holographic world based on something much more real. So that's the first interesting thing. The second thing with the idea of a simulation means that if you're running a simulation, you're testing something. You don't just, a simulation isn't just run for no reason at all. There's a reason for running it. And you'll also not run a simulation once, because I also had an experience in 1999 when I saw myself die in what we'll call a parallel reality, but you can also call it a looped reality. You could see this as a type of time loop. And it would make sense. If somebody is using this as an experiment, then they need experiences. You need data. And if Mark Devlin just has one life and lives one set of experiences, that's not very much data. It would make more sense if there were 10 million Mark Devlins living 10 million slightly different lives, and then you could get 10 million lives worth of data. And once I realized there's at least one more of me living a somewhat similar life who had just died in 1999, and I began tracking some of these other lives. And what was so interesting is the other lives that I was seemingly bumping into were all very plausible. Like, there was nothing like really goofy. There was nothing like that would be totally like, how could I have a life like that? Every life was quite logical as to, oh yeah, if I had actually just done this, focused on this a little bit more than this, that's exactly the kind of life I would have. Yeah, if I focused on this woman a little differently than this woman, yeah, I probably would have married her and would have had this kind of life. And it made sense. And it helped to explain certain things to me. And maybe some of your viewers get this. listeners, I guess, in this case, get this, where you wake up in the morning and you've just had a dream of an event in your life. And oh, yeah, I guess I was dreaming about that. Yeah, that was really interesting. I remember. And then you go on, you start making your breakfast and you start thinking, wait a minute, I don't think that happened. Did that? Yeah, it did happen. No, I'm not sure it did. And originally when some of these would come up, I called some certain friends who would have been there for these events, and they'd be like, "What are you talking about?" Like this thing that happened, like when, like 10 years ago. Don't you remember we did this and this? No, I don't know what you're talking about. And that didn't start to make sense until I understood we'll call them. I actually think of them as looped lives. I think of them as actually like we're living in a gigantic time loop, more than necessarily parallel, similar realities. But they're all, they're non-local because time is non-local. But it makes sense that at night, consciousness is bleeding between, you might say, one me to another me. So I'm experiencing a true event that's happening to Howdie Mickoski, just not this particular version that's here having this conversation with you now, just a different version in a different reality. And that's why when you wake up, you feel that's a real event that really happened to me, but you can't actually place it in your own life because it didn't happen in this one. So it's another thing that ties into all of this, and it breaks self-importance really quickly because we like to think it's what we do is really important, who we are is really important, what I do or don't do in my life is so vital. Once you realize there's 10 million or 100 million of you, you've done everything. Like you've succeeded at everything, you've failed at everything. So what actually happens in this life to me now is just from the standpoint of the thing sitting here is just two things. It's one, it's data collection and energy collection for the beings that created this simulation, or B, it is taking control of some of that energy and awareness, turning within to the thing within me that is true, and allowing the thing that is true to grow and strengthen. Because some people who read, of course, read my book, they come across it and they say, "But you're really negative. You have a really negative perspective. It's really it's so depressing." Well, actually, it's not. To me, I think it's about finding one's true power. It's about finding that which you are. It's about finding the totality of what is beyond a potential simulated reality. And unfortunately, to get there, you have to go through the gigantic walls of false, the gigantic walls of deception. And going through those walls are very, very difficult and painful because we've built our whole identity and our whole personality and our whole way of being on those walls. So they don't like to give in very easily. And usually someone's going to need some trauma. Someone's going to need some suffering to themselves or someone close to them to start having some of those walls get some cracks in them. And if we go looking, we can crack a few of those walls open and see what the walls have been hiding from us. So I think everything I'm sharing is actually extremely powerful and extremely important, but it can sound negative on the beginning because it's not promising everlasting happiness and all sorts of wonderment in this realm. It's offering stark, honest look at the shithole, I call it a suffering pit of hell, that we experience, and then it's asking, okay, what else could there be? What else is not this? And the whole realm is designed to distract us into anything external, anything about it, and never asking that question. Well, what then isn't a lie? What is the thing that's not deception?
Right. Well, the glory days of the 90s, when the only things that mattered to me were parties and tunes and clubs and stuff, are long gone now. It's a long time in the past. And I think this is fast becoming a 2 or 3 listen podcast to get the full impact of it. Does what you just spoke to there explain the so-called Mandela effect?
Uh, Hard to say. My feeling is that, and
Or
again, it's
let me
just a
ask you
feel.
if you feel that's a valid phenomenon.
Yes, We'll start there. Yes, I do believe that again, because if you find that reality is transparent, that it's not solid, then of course it can change.
Right.
So that was obvious to me because I've seen it. I've actually seen it happen, like in real time. The problem is when you get to what known as the Mandela effect. The reason I think that it's not just organic, that I think it's that there's a scripting behind it, is because what tends to be changing in the Mandela effect It's the words of a song. It's a little piece of a movie. It's nothing. It's nothing major, right? Like if it's totally organic, if these changes are just literally random, then at some point, it's like take someone like me who is a sports historian for a long part of my life. If somebody ever gave me a record book and said like, hey, actually the New York Yankees didn't win the 1961 World Series, it was Cincinnati, or if hey, the Montreal Canadiens didn't win the 1956 Stanley Cup, it was somebody else, would be like, what? That's impossible. That book is wrong. No, no, no. Every book says the same thing. So it's also interesting that things that you might call extreme geek mathematical factoids would be able to, come to unbelievably strong opposition to those aren't the things that are changing right now. They're these little things, and I think they
Mm.
are actually they're being done for a reason. And I get the sense that the simulation is ending. We are in the near ending part of whatever this thing is we've lived from whenever we started. Um, I guess we should go into two things about simulation. We haven't yet. We haven't talked about memory wipes, and we haven't talked about um, yeah,
Right.
we haven't talked about simulations yet. Do you want to go into that stuff first, or do you want me to finish what I was going
Well,
there?
we should go into that stuff, but I just want to jump in and ask you about so-called synchronistic happenings as well. So I heard you speak in a previous interview about how you often or you can see 10 of the same car that all just pass you on the road at the same time. And with me, it happens with
Right.
music. So I'll wake up in the morning, I'll have a particular song in my mind for no apparent reason. Then I'll go out, walk into a shop or a cafe or something, and that very song is playing. And I've not heard it for like 20 years. And then I'll see a reference to that group or that musician later that day. So something is causing all these things to converge and come together. And it is consistent with the idea of a sort of computer code or data of some kind being brought together. So we hear about energy, frequency, and vibration all the time in this reality. But what if there's more going on here than that? And it's like computer code or data of some sort, which causes these things to all converge on each other.
Right. And that ties into the idea of a simulation, the idea of a we'll call it like a computer generated reality,
Right.
which I would say that it is. The again, the indications of what we experience on a day by day basis tells us that. One of the things you would do, of course, if you were building a simulation is two things. Again, one, you want to have something to build it on. So in this case, this simulation had a particular start point. And this is very important for me to reiterate that we have to know when the simulation began. Like if the simulation began, I don't know, April the 10th, 1937, then that would mean everything prior to that we think of as history is just backstory to a Westworld robot, right? It didn't actually even happen at all in our what we think of as our reality. It's literally just a story that's been put in. How about this to make your mind spin? What if the simulation started in July 9th, 2009? That would mean everything that you think of you did in your life is literally the same as what was programmed into Dolores and Maeve and whoever else in Westworld, the robots. That means how are we even for sure that what we believe is our life, how can we prove for sure that it really happened the way we believe? And again, that's the indication of a possible simulation. The other is if you're building a simulation from the standpoint of code, you want to try to simplify what's happening. So you want to have a lot of repetition. You want things to happen again and again and again because you don't have to code a billion things. You code 10,000 things. It's why so many people I think look similar to other people. Or they, you'll see one person that has sort of and you'll see sort of that view of 10 different people. That makes sense that you don't want to have 10 billion coded shells for people. That's again, the code is too large. It would make more sense if you had an X number and you just cut and pasted what you have. So that's another thing you're noticing is constant repetition, constant similarity. That again stems to code. The synchronicity itself, now we have a big problem. And the problem with synchronicity is for at least the last 40 years, the spiritual community has pumped how wonderful synchronicity is, that it's God speaking to you, that it's God putting you on your life path, and he's
Right.
putting all sorts of these wonderful coincidences in front of you so that you can be put on your destiny.
Right.
And it sounds nice. And there's lots of experiences in all of our lives where very strange events lead us, something comes up. It happened many times in my life. And I just said, well, that because of that coincidence, I'm going to do that. I'm going to follow this thing. Or I'm going to talk to this person, or I'm going to go for that job or whatever, right? But we never were sitting, no one had ever sat there and said, hey, you know what? Maybe these coincidences are the same as what was happening to the Matt Damon character in the Adjustment Bureau, where it's a whole bunch of manipulative people who are deciding they're the ones who have a particular life path, a particular life story. They want all of these human creatures to live, and they are going to put synchronicities in place to, in a sense, not so much force us to take it, but get us to convince ourselves that the life path these beings have chosen for us is the one we want to take. So no one is out there questioning, like, hey, maybe all the synchronicities that are being thrown in front of us, they might actually be there to actually screw with us.
Right.
And that before we either follow or don't follow a synchronicity, we have to actually ask, what is this thing? Where is it coming from? It's obvious. It's more. We know so many of them are more than just coincidence. It's like very, very strange when they come up. It's obviously getting our attention. We have to ask who or what is attempting to get our attention before we would ever decide to follow them. So again, it becomes a gigantic overturning of even what's known as standard spirituality, which in itself is all built out of the New Age movement, which is, of course, as you know, with your music industry of looking into things like Laurel Canyon and all the bizarreness of how that was manufactured. The whole New Age movement was manufactured in itself.
Psyops
So
for
the entire
days.
spirit, yeah, the entire spiritual tradition we have is not really pure. It's manufactured things that help the system, not really totally help the people.
Right. Well, I can certainly relate to that because I used to subscribe to some of these more new agey sort of ideas of spirituality. And I used to think that when I saw my birthday, I would see this all the time, 12th of May, 1205. So I would always be seeing 1205s wherever I go. And I love the
Huh.
fact that as we record this, we're just about coming up to 1205 here in England. Here we go, 3 seconds. One. There you go. It's 12:05, just as I say this. And I used to think, oh, this is great. This is communication from the universe or the creator, and it's letting me know I'm on the right path and I've just got to keep doing what I'm doing. But in more recent times, when I've started to have some of these larger questions, I've started to view it in a slightly more sinister way, and not necessarily benevolent, just as you were saying there. So I'm asking what is causing these synchronicities to come together. And you mentioned that we get these ideas communicated through us to us through TV shows and movies like Westworld or The Matrix or The Truman Show. Why do you feel they do this? Because it's as if they're placing the truth in plain sight. I mean, I talk about this in my work, but I'd be interested in your take. They seem to be telling us what sort of reality we're living in, and it's right there coded in movies and TV shows. But they seem to be telling us, don't they?
Yeah, there's two pieces I think that came out of from your conversation there. The first is, for me anyway, there was a major shift 2 or 3 years ago when I finally let go of the standard foundational program, which is this world was created by a loving God who cares about you, who built this world for you to have like an equivalent of a school where you can learn and you can grow and you can eventually perfect yourself and rejoin this God in blissful happiness.
Yep.
And I realized that actually what the Cathars and the Gnostics and some ancient Egyptian texts and whatever said is actually true, that it's built by an evil deity, um, with various names, Rex Mundi to the Cathars, Yaldabaoth to the to the Gnostics, who created the realm as a AI simulation in which needed to be birthed or needed to, in order to live, had to bring in from the outside of it what the Gnostics called divine sparks, or being light beings of some type of light, pull them into the realm whose job was to get the simulation alive, get it running, and then operate as batteries for that system. Operate as it's an actually it's sick, but it's ingenious, which is build a video game, build like a massive video game. Think what if this really is a computer realm, all the whole massive universe and multiple universes, parallel realities, the kind of computing power you would need to run something like that would be staggering. It's brilliant if you, let's get the video game characters who are in the game. They're going to be the power source to keep the game running. So it becomes this giant, endless cycle of just the beings in the game have the only job of keeping the game running so the game never ends. And that is how I've come to see this realm, that's really on a core level what's going on. And so the the ingenious part of it is to start seeing through that, to see what's really being done, and then to say, okay, if I'm something else that's not from the video game, then where do I come from? What's not part of the video game, but the video game is so compelling, and suffering is built into the video game. Trauma is built into this place, not only for part of the energy extraction, but they extract the good stuff too. Don't think it's only. I hear this if you just want to not be in the matrix anymore. Don't have any more fear and think nice thoughts and be a good person. And like, well, no, they'll take the good stuff too. They don't care where your energy comes from. It's just certain things are more useful than other things. So it leads me in that respect to, I talk about Arthur Schopenhauer a lot. And while Schopenhauer didn't figure out like how to exit the matrix, he at least recognized this is a world of suffering. So the best thing we can do within a realm of suffering, and in a prison world, as he called it, is to focus on reducing suffering for ourselves and for any other beings we come across. And one of the things that is, at least for me, happened now over the last 2 or 3 years of this particular work is I've gained an unbelievable, on one side, empathy for all other creatures. It doesn't matter whether they're birds, animals, trees, rocks.
Yeah.
I know everything is part of the same trap that I'm in as well. We're all kind of in this together, and all of us are. I mean, nature's a real suffering pit of hell. Now, I love nature. I love being in it. I love sitting peacefully in it. It's calm, and we like to look at that side. We try to forget that everything in nature is trying to eat something else all the time. Like, how many worms have just died to feed the birds in the last minute? How many mice have just died to feed all
I
sorts
think
of
about that
animals?
stuff all the time.
Yep.
I've done since
Yep.
childhood.
And that's another example of, if any creator could have created a realm, and if you do need energy movement and energy extraction, you could have created it in a very different way than the need for other creatures to actually painful suffer just so another creature continues living. There could be totally different ways of energy movement. So the fact that this is what was built in, this is what the system wants. The system wants the pain, suffering, the anxiety. I mean, I watch deer out in my morning who are eating in the fields out in front of me. And of course, they always lift their head up about every 20 seconds. Why? Because they're wondering, is something sneaking up behind me to eat me?
They're in constant fear.
Anxiety.
We used to have pet rabbits, and I used to let them out in the garden, and they'd never faced predators because they were always pets. But you could just see the fear in their eyes. They just lived their entire lives in fear because that idea that a predator might come after them is just inbuilt into their DNA.
Right.
And all living creatures just seem to live in fear.
Yeah, it's the same thing with us. The problem is there's been this gigantic lie that's been presented. Humans are the top of the food chain. Nothing eats you. You do all the eating, and the food chain goes down from humans. But darned if humans aren't constantly filled with anxiety, constantly filled with fear.
Right.
And until people start realizing that these things that the Gnostics wrote about, what they called archons, what made its way into Castaneda's last book about mud shadows, what made it into various other ancient texts, that there is another class of beings which are unseen, which eat us. They eat our energy while we're alive. They eat our energy when we're dead, and we know that. There's a deep level of feeling. We know this is going on. So actually, the weird anxiety that humans feel is justified, because we sense that something is sucking me dry constantly, and I don't know where that energy's going. And generally, people don't know how to get it back. And a
Well,
lot of the early work I was taught from people like Mr. Park and the native medicine men really had it as its foundation was how to stop the energy loss and how to get back the energy that's been sucked out of you, because you need that energy to walk to the face of death while you're still alive, to walk into death while living. Because if you want to know the truth of this realm, you have to look on the other side of death. And if you're going to look on the other side of death, you need a lot of energy. If you're low in energy, even if you get the peak, you'll either die, physically die, or you'll come back and you'll be basically a mental wreck. And I think a lot of the people who walk around pushing shopping carts and talking to themselves, or are in current mental hospitals, a lot of those people, I think, are there because they had a look on the other side of reality. They actually saw something completely true. They saw something absolutely, but when they came back, they had no one was able to share with them that, hey, actually you saw something real, not something totally crazy. And their system didn't have enough energy to handle it, and they didn't have enough preparation as to what might be going on. So of course, the egoic self that was left just literally broke, it shattered, and becomes very, very difficult to try to repackage again a shattered ego. But it doesn't necessarily mean they've just gone crazy. They've gone crazy because they saw something that they're not supposed to have seen, not supposed to have known, and then there was nobody around to help guide them through this work. It happened to me. I'll share I'll share a story I've told a few times, but it happened one time with me. I was in my mother's town. I was visiting her around 2003 or something, small town in Canada. And I began thinking to myself, kind of like a Truman Show idea was, I always walk down the same street, turn here, turn here. I never go down. There's an area of our town I never ever went to. And I wondered what would happen if I went just randomly to a place I never go. What would that be like? Does it even exist? So where I would normally turn right, I just quickly turned left and ran like almost as fast as I could to a street I'd never been on. It was absolutely still. It was silent. There wasn't even a sound. It was just absolute stillness for about 10 seconds. And then all the doors opened. People started coming out, getting in their cars. Dogs started running around. It was like literally the scene had just manifested itself of street in a town, because I was on the street testing to see if the street existed. It's like it literally manifested itself. It was just, it was so bizarre. And this was in a period of like, I'm going through all of these practices, testing this stuff. And I remember I sent a message to Mr. Park, was still alive back then. He didn't really speak much English, but it was translated into Korean for him. And then they messaged back to me. And the message was something like, yeah, Mr. Park said he thinks you're going crazy, but he thinks it's pretty funny. You should maybe just go and play golf for a couple of days and just kind of just ground a little bit, and then have some time to think about your experience. And so I got this great thing. He thinks I'm going crazy, but he thinks it's funny, first of all. Okay, so it's obviously not a problem, but it is indicating that something's cracking in my mind. He seemed to sense that it wasn't the right time for my mind to fully crack yet. So he gave me something to do that was grounding at that particular time, which it did. I golfed for 2 straight days. I grounded at that point. And then I was very much able to just journal and write and sit with that experience and bring it up like I am now, make it as another very bizarre experience in a very long life of strange things. But what if I didn't have Mr. Park at that time? What if I kept pushing my mind and it cracked and I didn't have somebody then to help me with it? Who knows what could have happened? So it's a really good example for me of how something similar could have happened to somebody else. And if they didn't have someone like that to offer a little bit of guidance, it could make sense how somebody could have had a real experience and it actually made their life worse than it did make it better.
Yeah. You wanted to speak on the memory wipe and how that ties in.
Yeah, that's another one that indicated for me right away that we're obviously living in some kind of hell. And that is the story that we're living in a a school, that we're living in some kind of cosmic school can't be true because, and assuming if you come to believe reincarnation is true, which I now do, there's just too many stories, young children's stories of recalling lives in such detail that is beyond any sort of possibility other than they're connecting directly with some sort of other existence. And of course, I've had these lives where I realized I've lived the same life over and over and over again. So I've come to see that there's some sort of, reincarnation doesn't have to be reincarnating into a new body. It can literally be, you know, being Mark Devlin again and again and again and again. That's also reincarnation. Some actually wonder
Oh, Lord,
or
no,
still
please.
question if that, yeah, if that's what the Buddha really meant, that you only live one life. You only have there aren't multiple lives of different characters. There's just multiple lives of yourself. But anyway, the point being is either one of those I now see as completely true. The only way then you could have this say is a school if you remembered each and every one of those lives completely. That's how we learn.
Right.
If the first time I touch a hot stove, my hand gets burned and I realize, oh, touching a hot stove is not a good idea. The next time stoves are hot, I don't touch it. I've grown. But if every life you live, you go through a bunch of experiences, learn some stuff, and then come back absolutely ignorant in the next life,
Hmm.
that's not learning. That's insanity, is
What's the
actually what it
point?
is. And yeah, so once you begin to dig into a number of people who remember have pre-birth memories and they kind of remember this moment where in hermetic terms they call it you take the cup of forgetfulness, or there's certain terms in Asian philosophy and whatnot where you're made to forget. As soon as you're made to forget your previous life, this can't be a place of learning anymore. And again, we use Westworld. It's a really good example. That's the story of Westworld, right? The robots go out, they get murdered and raped and killed. And then when they die, they go back to mission control. They get cleaned up, refixed, and then they get memory wiped. They forget the last experience again so they can go back and be murdered and raped and killed again. And really, the story of Westworld is the story of Maeve and Dolores. They become ones who remember their previous lives and remember these previous experiences, which are just at their expense. They're the whole world is done basically to treat them like garbage, and they decide, okay, I'm not interested in this realm anymore. I'm going to see what's on the other side of Westworld. It can't be any worse than this. And that kind of becomes, I think, someone who I call an exit the cave walker, someone who's, you might say, following people like me, or I've got some really great people who've been joining my locals channel and spending time having these really, really deep discussions together and conversations together, is that someone has started to have these memories of it's not just this life that's shit. It's any life that may have ever had. And it's all the animals, it's all the birds. It's like everything here is going through a hellish experience,
Right.
and it's going to get worse. I hate to be the one to tell people this. It's not going to get any better. This is another problem, another way this is a hell. Generally, when the average person sees, hey, the world's insane. Well, one way or another, this place is insane. Their first natural instinct, because humans have a natural instinct, I think, it's built into us to be helpful. Our first natural instinct, well, I need to fix it. The realm's insane. I'm going to try to fix it. And it never works. The
Hmm.
realm gets worse and worse and worse. The more people try to fix it, the worse it gets. Why? Because once you see that it was built to be insane, it was built to be a suffering pit of hell, then if that's the way the video game was coded, your attempt to do something different in the video game, that would be the insanity, as opposed to saying, wait a minute, okay, this is how the game is coded. So instead of trying to fix the game, what seems to work is to take that energy, and instead of trying to change everything, I change myself, and I change or transform small groups of individuals and small parts of my immediate environment. That does seem to have great possibility. And for me, once this realization of trying to change a thing that was built to be insane is also insane and is also a trap. But if I transform and work with a very small group or work with those in my environment, that where I live, make that actually a more, as I call it, sane place. Somebody asked me, what do you do with your life? And my number one thing is remain as sane as possible in every moment. That the best response to an insane reality is to become even more internally sane. What more do you really need to do on a base level than that? Is just find your own inner sanity and just live that. And I think if you can do that and influence a small group around you, that in itself is great power, because it's not being, as soon as it goes out and tries to fix everything, that energy just gets sucked. But it's like the system kind of, it's too much for it to then track everybody just working in their own little area, and it just can't over, it can only catch if it's, if it can only catch you if you're trying to do too much. So it's also learning then what's the right use of your energy, what's the right use of your time, what's the best way to experience and deal with such an insane reality. And again, it's, I would say on simplistic terms, it's find what sanity is and live that. Two, it's to recognize the best day-to-day activity is reduce suffering, find ways not to find happiness, to reduce your own suffering and the suffering of those around you and those beings around you. Is there, it can be, really, really simple little things, but they can have, you've just reduced suffering for someone or something else. That's a really good start. Of
Mm.
course, if you're going to potentially exit the matrix, it's a potential lifelong journey to complete that. But you work with where you are currently.
And that small group of people you might try and influence could just be your own family. Uh, it doesn't have to go beyond that. And people will say, oh, that's selfish. You're supposed to help others and reach out to others. And I try and do that through my work. And I know that many others do as well. But what you've just outlined there does explain why so many bad things tend to happen to good people. So people try and do good works, they try and make this world a better place, they try and help others, and all they seem to reap as a result is more suffering. So
Yeah.
and this just repeats itself. There's endless examples of it. So maybe the answer does lie in what you've just said there, knowing your
Right.
limitations, trying to reduce suffering as far as it's within your power. And that might just involve you and your own family and not going beyond that. That
Right.
does make a lot of
Yeah.
sense.
I mean, think how many people in the course of history have sent prayers to God asking for world peace or to
Yep.
fix this or to fix that. What,
There you go.
billions, trillions of prayers? How many
Exactly.
people, like I say, have gone out to do truly honest, good, intentioned work that seemed to have absolutely no impact at all?
Yeah.
And yet there were others who seemed on the surface to be doing very little. Like you say, they were working in small little ways, but down the road, their impact seemed to be quite massive. Like again, I look at the people that I had the great opportunity to spend time with, and they certainly were not. They weren't running workshops. They weren't doing. They lived on an Indian reserve. If you came and saw them, they would spend time with you. Same thing. We had to go see Mr. Park, but those people that these people influenced, that I saw, who really worked hard with them and really gave an interactive way with them, got something out of it. Like we all transformed in some way. So yeah, somehow it's about, and like you say, it's also a challenge of like, well, maybe it's not your family that's the group. Like maybe the help you're trying to give, your family doesn't want it. Actually, that's the case with a lot of people, right? A lot of
That
people are
can happen. Yeah.
working in, yeah, they're seeing a lot of new things and they want, oh, I'm sharing with my workshops. They weren't doing, they lived on an Indian reserve. If you came and saw them, they would spend time with you. Same thing. We had to go see Mr. Park, but those people that these people influenced, that I saw, who really worked hard with them and really gave an interactive way with them, got something out of it. Like we all transformed in some way. So yeah, somehow it's about, and like you say, it's also a challenge of like, well, maybe it's not your family that's the group. Like maybe the help you're trying to give, your family doesn't want it. Actually, that's the case with a lot of people, right? A lot of
That
people are
can happen. Yeah.
working in, yeah, they're seeing a lot of new things and they want, oh, I'm sharing with my family. And hey, you're nuts. Just stop talking like this, you know?
Yeah, they don't want to
But
know.
it might be some other friends, or maybe ones that you didn't even really know were friends. They were kind of acquaintances, but all of a sudden, if you bring up the right subjects with them, you find out, oh, actually, these are the ones that now I have the most, like you say, back 30 years ago, the kind of people that I would go out and have drink. I was an alcoholic back then. It's one of the things that I stopped back in 1999, along with a lot of other things. Those kind of people are not anywhere the kind of people, not that I'm bad with them or that they're still old friends. If I saw them on the street or something, I'd say hi to them, but they're not the kind of people that's right for me to spend my time and energy with where I am now. And that's a part of the game is saying, is not saying I'm supposed to be friends with this person. I'm supposed to be in a close group with this person. It's that I am supposed to be connected with somebody. It's who are the right ones now that fit the me that I am right now, and that can also take a bit of time just spent alone and contemplate who you are, what kind of things are important to you, what kind of things are your values, and then being okay to know there are others out there who think like that. And even if you maybe don't find them in your life, like as an example, like on this very podcast that you're listening to, there'll be other people who listen to Mark, obviously, who have similar views, right? Obviously, if they're listening to Mark often, they have similar views as him and probably to you. There's an opportunity for, even though you might not be able to meet in person to start with, there's other people, if you feel alone, that you can reach out to and potentially begin the possibility of having some connections where you can actually start sharing and being the way you feel you want to be. And that's another really important step, is having someone else that you feel you can be honest with. And you don't always have to say things in such a way that makes them feel comfortable with, but to actually just say, this is how I feel, this is how I think, this is what I believe. And the other person you're presenting, yeah, I kind of think the same way. So they're out there. It just might take a little time to find them, and just being confident and patient that it might not happen tomorrow, but they're there.
An overriding big question that I've got, and I think I'm going to ask this of every guest I have on regarding these subjects for as long as the question remains. And I've mentioned this in a few of my solo videos as well. If this reality was usurped by some, what we might call a demiurge force, where was the original God of creation when this happened? You mentioned earlier that we are divine sparks, suggesting that we're aspects or individuated units of the original creative force, which we would call God. But where was that original creative force when we were tricked or trapped into this reality, and this demiurge force, whatever it is, demonic force, was allowed to take control? Where was the supreme creator of everything? If this force is benevolent, it suggests that that creative force was rendered powerless, or just didn't care enough to intervene and prevent this hijacking from taking place.
Yeah. What would your answer be to that, out of curiosity?
I'm seeking the answer. From everything I've seen so far, it points towards the horrific possibility that maybe the original creator is not benevolent in nature.
There's a very interesting article I'd recommend you read. It's by Romanian philosopher Emil Sioban, and it's called The Evil Demiurge. And within that essay, which I think he wrote in the mid 1960s, he indicates that there there is a good God, and then you have this demiurge, which is evil. The good, this is very, very, very unique. Good cannot create. Good has no need to create, because if it's good, it just is. It's like if you're having a very pleasant, enjoyable evening on the couch, you don't need to make anything different. You only need to make things different because you don't like something. So in Sioban's belief, only evil creates. And so that is why you might say, well, why did the good God not do anything? Because technically, good does not create, and therefore good is not all that concerned too much with creation as it is.
Which is an
Now,
inversion
according
of
to,
that's an
yeah,
inversion of what we're entrained to think of. Because I've
yeah,
heard so many times that only good can create and evil
right.
can't. Evil can only mimic what's already there.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of this stuff it really does make you think. I mean, I don't know which is true. It's just, it's a very interesting perspective. It also makes you ask a lot of questions. Something that bothers me, but it's something that bothers me a lot when I, not just in interviews, when I hear people speaking about, oh, we're creator beings and we're here to create more. And this will, I'm finally tying back to your movie question, which is why are all these things in movies? Why are all these ideas pre-programmed in?
Hmm.
Is because the best way for the demiurge to keep creating is, again, not just to have the creatures in the simulation taking energy from them, but to be the ones projecting the simulation externally. So we are constantly creating, but all we're creating generally is the exact simulation that the fallen evil creator wants. And the more that can be placed in our subconscious of what you might say the external reality that's wanted, then because that's there, that's what'll start coming out. It's those old Darren Brown ideas, right? That if you want somebody to be unable to remember their phone number, you ask them try to remember your phone number. By using the word try, you've indicated that you're not doing it, so they never can, right? These tricks of words and tricks of mind play.
Mm.
And that's what's going on constantly with our subconscious, that the subconscious is constantly being programmed by the matrix in order to then actually project out the very thing that the matrix is wanting projected. It's a very sneaky system that's been put into place here, and that's an important part of it when we realize. And I don't want to say you're making your whole reality. This is something I also want to be very. I also totally disagree with this idea, but you're creating some of it. So just because something awful's happened to you, that's not necessarily your fault. You did not create that. Like Mark had just said, you know, you're not going to come into a realm and think, I'm going to see how much suffering I can have in the course of my realm. No, the realm, you might say there's two different forces, just like a hologram. There's two different waves going out to make the creation. So the reality is putting one of the waves out. It's doing one set of things are coming directly from the matrix. One set of things you might say are coming from the various creatures in it, including humans. So some of what is being created by us. Some of it is not. And we can eventually start to realize that that's a projection, and we can begin not just changing the projection. That's normally people go, well, if I'm projecting bad things, I want to start projecting good things. You actually want to start asking, who or what is the projector? Where is the projection coming from? Where is the loading of the projection happening? And that again, it's a different way of normally tackling these issues. Normally it's, I have negative thoughts, so I'm going to stop negative thoughts and I'm going to have good thoughts, as opposed to, why don't you do an examination of what thought is first? Before you need to find out if you need to stop it, you should find out where does it come from? Where do thoughts originate? What are they? And that was a huge part of my journey years ago, was when I moved from the normal way of tackling an issue or what you might call a spiritual or philosophical challenge, and asked those kind of questions. Not how do I stop thought? How do I change thought? It's, what is thought? How can I find out what it is? And once you would actually know what it is, then you could make determinations of if you need to do anything with it or not. So it's, a lot of this stuff is it's also inverted in the way it's presented to us. I call it distorted, but inverted is another way. It's all upside down, and a lot of what we have to do is turn it back to the other way to see, okay, if I start looking at it in this inverted way, I actually, that'll help me understand what's really going on. That'll help me understand what this matrix realm is, and then you can actually begin making better choices of how one should behave in the realm. It's, until you see it clearly, everything you do is just a giant question mark. You don't know if it really has a value or not.
Mm. It's interesting because the more I delve into these subject areas and get more and more engrossed in them, although they're very dark in nature, some of them, they don't make me bitter to the point that I just think, well, fuck everyone and fuck everything. I'm just going to be selfish and look after myself. I find it's making me more compassionate and more empathetic towards other living beings. So you might think that the opposite would happen, but it's actually making me care more, which is an interesting thing. Maybe it's been the same for you.
Like I said, the empathy that's developed now, the more I've realized that um, the tree I look out outside the window is, in a sense, is trapped as, or is we're trapped and we're not trapped. This is also one of the very challenging paradoxes in the whole thing, right? There is a trap, and we have to understand the trap, and we have to understand what that is, and then we also have to realize, but there's actually what we are cannot be trapped. We're only trapped because, in a sense, we're in the type of coma and are allowing the trap to happen. That the trap isn't something external. It's like we've stuck our head in the trap and we are the ones keeping ourselves in the trap. And we can actually, it doesn't actually, you don't actually get out of it. You just see that you can't actually be in one to start with. It's the idea that a good friend of mine, Norio Kushi, uh, shared this once when we were having one of my many group discussions. And he was very reminding of only that which is true will exit the matrix. Everything which is false is from the matrix, so it cannot leave. So therefore, you must find the only thing of you that is true. And what's interesting is everything that we think we are is all part of the matrix. And therefore, as long as we're holding on to anything that is not actually what's true, we can't actually exit. Again, the symbolism of the eye of the needle, right? You have to pass through the eye of a needle. Well, that again indicates that it has to be wispy and transparent, and yeah, it's a search for that which you are, and the only way you do that, which is again one of my favorite Richard Rose presentations of all this, is you don't actually find what's true. You look for false. And when you find false, you drop it and you let go of it. Then you find more false and you drop that. You find more false and you drop that. Then eventually you'll come to something that no matter how hard you try to drop it, no matter how hard you try to say it's false, you can't. And then you realize, oh, that's the truth. Wow. And it should always surprise you. That's one thing that just about anybody who I've come to trust talk about ultimate truth. One of the things they will always say is that when they discovered what's true, it was an unbelievable surprise. They never would have guessed truth was what it actually is. And that's one of the places everyone gets caught. Everyone is told what the truth is supposed to be or told what they ultimately are. And then they go on a giant seeking pathway to prove it, to prove that's, and usually it sounds good. So they go, as opposed to, I don't know what it is. I have no clue what it is, but I can find out what it's not. And every time I find something that's not, say, for example, all the stuff we talked about history, that's another thing. Oh, history's false. I can drop that. Oh, this is false. I drop that. Oh, eating 5 donuts for breakfast. That's not really good for my body. So I drop that. Anything that's false, you just drop it, drop it, drop it. Like I say, eventually there comes to something and like, wow, I can't drop this. That's the truth. Holy crap. So it was interesting. Rose described it as rather than a pathway forward towards a goal, it's actually going backwards, letting go of things and sinking deeper and deeper and deeper into what you are. And that's really the pathway. So again, it's the complete opposite of what people think a pathway to knowing really is.
Yeah. Many would maintain that when you come to a grudging acceptance that nothing in this realm is as we've been conditioned to think of it as, and spent most of our lives believing it to be, it can lead to a pretty bleak and hopeless worldview. These aren't happy subjects. They're dark.
Mm-hmm.
Many of them are very dark, and many people are going to struggle with them. So, what coping mechanisms do you employ to navigate all this? I find irony in the fact that you used to be a stand-up comedian and you're dealing with all this really dark stuff. Or maybe you find it liberating and empowering in some way to have reached these realizations. And that's what carries you through. And maybe that's best advice for others. See coming across this information as liberating. Don't see it as dark. See it as a pathway towards hopefully finding our way out of here.
Yeah, maybe this will be a good question to sort of end our conversation on.
Sure,
Was a really valuable, important question. So this might be a good thing to leave
sure.
for our viewers, or I keep calling viewers, your listeners today. Um, yeah, it's these realizations are only dark and depressing for the mind. They're dark and depressing for the me thing that I've always believed myself to be, because every time something that's revealed is false, that false is part of the thing that I've built, who I am, and therefore how I interact with the world, what I believe, what I think. All of those things are interconnected. So, this, we'll call it mind mechanism, doesn't like these things to be revealed. So, it is actually the thing that makes it for people depressing and dark, because in a sense, it's saying if you keep going, then this mind thing that you've trusted your whole life might be gone. You don't want to be living without me, do you? And I can say that when I was in the canyon, when I fell into that river just going over the waterfall, and I was seconds before death, the very thing you would think that would be the most valuable tool, which would be thought, was gone. It just, it literally did not exist. There was no such thing as thought. And I realized all the thoughts I've ever had in my life were false, were just false concepts that were almost fed in from an external radio. It's the best way of describing it. What existed in that moment were, I called them bubbles of perception, or total bubbles of understanding. And they would just come, they would explode in sense in front of my face. Whatever was in that bubble would be completely understood. And then that bubble would leave. And then a new bubble would come of information, and it would burst, and it would be totally known. And I came to realize that's really our our existence. Our existence is really, if the whole thing I'd ever thought of as me was gone, would just be these bubbles of information that would burst into our awareness in totality. And so going into this subject is dangerous for the thing that you see in the mirror every day that you believe to be you. It's not dangerous for who you really are. All of these things to the thing you really are, it is like the greatest energy boost possible for it. It's you might say it's turning on this divine spark again. It's turning up the heat on it. And after a certain point of time, like you were saying, you would feel this would be depressing, but it's not. I mean, in your case, you did a lot of your inner work on yourself, I think, by going into the music industry, by having to look into something that you obviously for a long period in your life almost, we'll say, believed in, right? You thought
Hmm.
this is great, this is wonderful, this, and all of a sudden you started realizing, wow, it's not.
Yeah.
So it's
It used
not
to be
just the
my whole
music.
my whole value system. It's all I cared
Right.
about.
Yeah. And so when you begin all of a sudden to see, actually, it's not just the music industry you were chopping away. It was the you that had linked to it. The mark thing that, like you say, made it their whole life.
Yeah.
And then once you break all that away, all of a sudden there becomes a potential space of like, well, something totally different can arise now. And normally somebody will just fill it with something else, right? They'll get rid of one obsession and they'll put in a new obsession. But some people choose not to put a new obsession and just let this inner space kind of grow and build on its own and see what comes from it. And that's where you might say, actually, then it's not scary at all, because you start noticing, hey, I'm tapping into something that's always been here, but I've never tapped into it before. Why not? And that's what starts to grow. So all of this stuff, I guess, we've been talking about today is, that's what it's, the end result is just, you might say, turning the light up, turning the heat up of the thing that has really been you, since existence, and has just been falsely covered over by something that has believed its main focus is what goes on here. Now, that doesn't mean, because this is the other area that gets me concern, and again, I'm wrapping this up, people, so you don't have to sit around with us longer. But it's this kind of also modern spiritual idea when they say, "Oh, well, the world's not real, you're not real, so don't worry about it. It doesn't matter if people are getting blown up here, and if people are dying there, and
Right. Because
if
it's all
people are getting,
illusory.
it's all just an illusion. So just drink your tea, haha." And that won't work either, because the pathway is 1 foot within the reality. This particular reality, it might be false, but it is a constant experience. It's a constant experience that awareness is having. So you can't ignore it, and you can't pretend that it's something other than the way it is. Yet you also have then 1 foot outside of it to see the reality in its totality, so that it doesn't drag you in. That's where you can get the compassion and empathy, but not get the being having both feet pulled in and doing more than is required. It's also not trying to get both feet out of it and try to just pretend like it doesn't matter. Um, these people will say that, and then all of a sudden they get a really bad illness, or their sister gets in a car accident or something, and all of a sudden their lofty spiritual goals no longer add up when it affects them personally.
Hmm.
So it becomes a very astute way of 1 foot in, 1 foot out. You're here and you're not here at the same time. You acknowledge it, but you don't overly identify with it. You see it for what it is, and you know when it's your turn to be called. You know when it's your turn to put on your acting clothes, you might say, and act the way you're supposed to act, and then you can go back and let this crazy insane place do what this crazy insane place does, and put our energy and focus on that which is most important to us.
Right. Well, that is a great point to start to wrap up. So thank you for your time. We've done nearly 2 hours. I hadn't intended to do this long, but great conversation. Where can listeners find your work online and get hold of your books? And is there anything else that you're doing that you'd like to put across as well?
Well, the most thing I've been today, I've been building a greenhouse, so that's a lot of the personal stuff, which is just getting all the planting done, and it's being living a more self-sufficient, really growing your own food lifestyle. But if you Google search my name, which I'm sure will be in the description somewhere, and my from my website, you'll be able to. I still have a blog that runs a little bit that I keep up. All my books would be there, be it Exit the Cave, Exposing the Expositions, Falling for Truth. There are links there where you can read some free chapters, and of course there'll be Amazon links for those books. But you don't have to ever buy a book from them. You can buy them from any source you would like. Exit the Cave as well has a donation PDF available, so you can actually, because I wanted to make that book available for people as cheaply as possible. So there's also a PDF version, and from there you could then find my locals channel, which is because I've kind of left YouTube. YouTube is still there. There's still 250 videos or something, but the energy of that platform just has changed so much in the last couple of years that I wanted to go to a place where we could really have deep discussions and really have a kind of conversation around the subject that's important. So we went over to locals, and there's again a lot of free content there. All you have to do is sign up to locals, and you get a lot of that. There's a very small charge for a little bit of it, and for some of the things I do, it's like $2 or $3 a month, which is I wanted to again do something that is as 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 a, as accessible as possible. But most everything is there for free as well on locals. And yeah, that's where I'm at. I'm working on the new book. It's slow process. It's very challenging material, and it's why I'm not really talking about what's in the new book right now, because I'm still in the process of laying it out in a way that I think is valuable not only for me, but then valuable for the reader. I'm hoping it'll be ready end of May, early June, but we will see how that goes, and how our little simulation goes forward. I get a sense there's going to be some fireworks coming really soon.
All right. Well, awesome conversation. Definitely a 2 or 3 times listen. Certainly is for me. So thanks for coming on today.
This is just for fun.
Vibrations.
picking up vibrations. I'm picking up